The wrench slipped from Maya Richardson's oil-stained fingers as the black sedan pulled into Henderson's auto repair. Through the grimy garage window, she watched a man in an immaculate military uniform step out of the vehicle, his chest decorated with ribbons and stars that caught the afternoon sunlight. 3 silver stars gleamed on his shoulder boards. Maya quickly ducked behind the engine block of the Ford pickup she'd been working on, her heart hammering against her ribs. Generals didn't just wander into small-town garages in Millbrook, Tennessee. They certainly didn't come looking for mechanics who preferred to stay invisible, mechanics who kept their purple hearts buried in dusty dresser drawers rather than displayed on mantels. But sometimes, the past has a way of finding you, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Richardson had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 28, she moved through the world like a shadow, preferring the company of carburetors to conversations, finding solace in the honest complexity of engines rather than the unpredictable nature of people. Henderson's auto repair had become her sanctuary, a place where her hands could work magic on broken machines while her mind stayed safely locked away from memories that threatened to surface. The garage sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Maya. She'd moved there 3 years ago, renting a small apartment above Garrett's hardware store on Main Street, and had somehow managed to remain a mystery despite living in a place where secrets were as rare as snow in July. People knew she was good with cars. Exceptional, really. But beyond that, Maya Richardson was just the quiet woman who fixed their engines and sent them on their way with minimal small talk. Her mornings began before sunrise, when the world was still painted in shades of gray, and the only sounds were her footsteps on the cracked asphalt and the distant rumble of freight trains heading toward Nashville. She'd unlock the garage with keys that Eddie Henderson had trusted her with after just 6 months of working there, brew coffee in the small break room that smelled perpetually of motor oil and cigarettes, and begin her day with the vehicles that had been left overnight. Eddie Henderson was 73 years old, with hands that bore the permanent stains of 5 decades spent under car hoods and a back that protested every time he tried to crawl beneath a chassis. He'd hired Maya after watching her diagnose a transmission problem that 2 other mechanics had missed, offering her the job on the spot with a grunt of approval and a firm handshake. He asked no questions about her past, seemed to understand that some people preferred their histories to remain unexamined, and in return, Maya had become the most reliable employee he'd ever had. The work suited her. There was something deeply satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again, about understanding the intricate dance of pistons and valves, about listening to the subtle variations in engine sounds that could reveal everything from a loose belt to a failing transmission. Cars didn't judge. They didn't ask uncomfortable questions or probe into wounds that hadn't properly healed. They simply presented problems to be solved, and Maya had always been exceptionally good at solving problems. Her reputation had grown quietly throughout Millbrook and the surrounding counties. Word traveled in the way it does in small communities, through whispered conversations at the diner, mentions at church socials, recommendations passed from neighbor to neighbor. People began specifically requesting Maya when they brought their vehicles in, trusting her steady hands and sharp mind with everything from routine oil changes to complex engine rebuilds. But Maya's skills extended far beyond what most people realized. Late at night, when the garage was closed and Eddie had gone home to his wife Margaret and their collection of rescue cats, Maya would work on her own projects. She'd salvage parts from vehicles destined for the scrapyard, combining them in ways that defied conventional automotive wisdom. She could make a 1987 Chevrolet run like it had just rolled off the assembly line, could coax power from engines that other mechanics would have declared beyond repair. These abilities hadn't developed in trade school or through years of apprenticeship. They'd been forged in the unforgiving heat of forward operating base Crimson in Afghanistan, where keeping vehicles running wasn't just a job, it was the difference between life and death, where a mechanic who could perform miracles with limited parts and impossible deadlines wasn't just valuable, they were essential to survival. Maya pushed those memories away as she always did, focusing instead on the immediate task at hand. Today it was Mrs. Patterson's Honda Civic, which had been making a grinding noise that 3 other shops had failed to diagnose properly. Maya had identified the problem within minutes, a worn wheel bearing that was on the verge of complete failure. but she took her time with the repair, savoring the methodical process of disassembly and reconstruction. The garage radio played classic rock at low volume, filling the space with familiar rhythms that helped mask the occasional rumble of military aircraft from the nearby National Guard base. Maya had learned to ignore those sounds, though they still sometimes caused her hands to pause in their work, her eyes to lose focus for just a moment before she pulled herself back to the present. Lunchtime came and went without Maya leaving the garage. She'd packed a sandwich and an apple in a brown paper bag, eating mechanically while reading technical manuals that Eddie kept stacked on his cluttered desk. She absorbed information about new diagnostic techniques and emerging automotive technologies, with the same intensity she'd once applied to studying IED patterns and vehicle armor configurations. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers. James Morrison needed an inspection sticker for his pickup truck. Sarah Chen dropped off her SUV for a routine oil change. Old Tom Bradley shuffled in with a complaint about his ancient Buick making funny noises, which turned out to be nothing more serious than a loose exhaust pipe. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Maya would listen carefully to the customer's description of the problem, ask a few specific technical questions, and then get to work with minimal conversation. She'd developed a reputation for being somewhat antisocial, but people tolerated her quiet nature because her work was impeccable and her prices were fair. What they didn't understand was that Maya's silence wasn't antisocial, it was protective. Every conversation carried the risk of someone asking the wrong question, of stumbling into territory that Maya had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. Questions about where she'd learned to work on heavy machinery, about the precise scars on her hands, about why someone with her obvious talents was content to work in a small-town garage instead of pursuing more lucrative opportunities. As the day wore on, Maya found herself thinking about the letter that had arrived the previous week. It sat unopened on her kitchen table, bearing the official seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs and her old service number typed neatly beneath her name. She'd recognized the envelope immediately, had felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety as she'd carried it upstairs to her apartment. The letter represented everything she'd tried to leave behind: the bureaucracy, the medical appointments, the constant reminders of service and sacrifice that she'd hoped to escape by disappearing into civilian anonymity. For 3 years, she'd successfully avoided contact with the VA system, declining follow-up appointments and ignoring phone calls from caseworkers who wanted to discuss her benefits and her transition to civilian life. Maya understood that most veterans would consider her approach foolish. The benefits were substantial, the medical care comprehensive, the support systems extensive, but accessing those resources required acknowledging a part of herself that she'd buried beneath layers of routine and deliberate isolation. It required admitting that Staff Sergeant Maya Richardson, combat engineer, had existed at all. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor as Maya finished up Mrs. Patterson's Honda. She'd replaced the wheel bearing, checked the brakes, and performed a general inspection that revealed a few minor issues she'd addressed during the customer's next visit. The work had taken longer than necessary, but Maya preferred thoroughness to speed, and preferred the meditative quality of careful, methodical labor. Eddie emerged from his small office, where he'd been wrestling with paperwork and insurance forms, and surveyed the garage with the satisfaction of a man who'd built something lasting. The business had been in his family for 40 years, passed down from his father, and he'd always assumed one of his sons would eventually take over. But both boys had left Millbrook for opportunities in larger cities, leaving Eddie to face the reality that Henderson's auto repair would likely die with him. "Maya," he said, wiping his hands on a red shop rag that had seen better days, "are you planning to stick around here long term?" The question caught Maya off guard. Eddie rarely engaged in personal conversation, respecting the boundaries she'd established around her private life. She looked up from the engine compartment where she'd been checking fluid levels, considering how to respond. "I don't have plans to leave," she said carefully. Eddie nodded, seeming to weigh her words. "Been thinking about the future of this place, about what happens when these old bones can't crawl under cars anymore." Maya understood the implication without Eddie having to spell it out. He was considering her as a potential successor, someone who could carry on the business he'd spent decades building. The idea should have been flattering, should have represented the kind of stability and belonging that most people craved. Instead, it filled Maya with a deep sense of unease. Permanence meant commitment. Commitment meant roots. And roots meant that when the past finally caught up with her, as she'd always known it eventually would, she'd have something to lose. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the garage door opening. Maya looked up to see a young woman entering, probably in her early 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes that suggested she'd come straight from some kind of manual labor job. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Maya couldn't quite place. "I'm looking for someone who might be able to help with my truck. It's been acting up, and I can't afford to take it to one of the big chain places." Maya wiped her hands on her coveralls and walked over to where the woman stood. Through the open garage door, she could see an aging Ford pickup parked outside, its red paint faded, and its body bearing the kind of dents and scratches that spoke of hard use rather than neglect. "What kind of problems are you having?" Maya asked. The woman, who introduced herself as Jessica Walsh, explained that the truck had been running rough, especially during cold starts, and that the check engine light had been intermittently illuminating for the past 2 weeks. She spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to describe mechanical problems accurately, probably through necessity rather than formal training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then walked outside to examine the vehicle. The Ford was older than she'd initially thought, probably mid-1990s, but it had been maintained with obvious care despite its age. Someone had put time and effort into keeping this truck running, and had treated it as more than just transportation. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" Maya asked. Jessica nodded and popped the latch. Maya lifted the hood and immediately began her examination, her trained eyes moving systematically through the engine compartment. Within minutes, she'd identified several potential issues: a vacuum leak, worn spark plug wires, and what appeared to be a failing oxygen sensor. "How long have you had this truck?" Maya asked, as she continued her inspection. "It was my dad's," Jessica replied, her voice carrying a note of emotion that she was clearly trying to suppress. "He passed away last year, and it's pretty much all I have left of him." Maya understood that feeling, the way certain objects could carry the weight of memory and loss. She'd once felt the same way about her grandfather's toolbox, the one that had traveled with her through 2 deployments, and now sat unused in her apartment closet. "I can fix the problems," Maya said, straightening up and closing the hood. "Nothing too serious, but it'll take a couple of days to get the parts." Jessica's relief was evident in the way her shoulders relaxed. "How much do you think it'll cost?" Maya quoted a price that was significantly lower than what the chain shops would charge, watching as Jessica's expression shifted from relief to gratitude. Money was obviously tight, and Maya found herself remembering what it felt like to count every dollar, to weigh every expense against absolute necessity. As Jessica filled out the paperwork and handed over her keys, Maya noticed something that made her pause. The young woman's left hand bore a small scar across the knuckles, the kind of mark that came from working with tools or machinery. But it was the way Jessica moved, the unconscious awareness of her surroundings, the way she positioned herself with clear sightlines to both entrances. These were habits that Maya recognized because she shared them. Eddie had returned to his office, leaving Maya alone with Jessica as they completed the transaction. As the young woman turned to leave, Maya found herself speaking almost without conscious thought. "Jessica," she said, "were you military?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both women understood. Jessica paused, her hand on the door frame, and for a moment Maya thought she wouldn't answer. "Army," Jessica said finally. "Motor transport. 2 tours in Iraq." Maya nodded, filing that information away. Motor transport operators faced dangers that civilian mechanics never had to consider: IEDs hidden beneath roadways, convoy attacks, the constant threat of enemy fire while trying to keep critical supply lines operational. "Thank you for your service," Maya said, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. Jessica's smile was brief but genuine. "Thank you for yours." After Jessica left, Maya stood in the empty garage surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal, trying to process the unexpected encounter. It had been months since she'd met another veteran, longer still since she'd acknowledged her own service to someone outside the VA system. The interaction had stirred something inside her, a recognition of shared experience that she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Jessica Walsh represented what Maya had tried so hard not to be: a veteran who wore her service as part of her identity, who acknowledged her military past as something that shaped her present. As the day wound down and Eddie prepared to close the garage, Maya found herself thinking about the unopened letter on her kitchen table. About Jessica's straightforward acknowledgement of her military service. About the way the young woman had looked when she'd mentioned her father's truck. The weight of loss and memory that Maya understood all too well. That evening, Maya climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, her body tired from a full day of physical labor but her mind restless with thoughts she'd been trying to suppress. She heated up a frozen dinner, ate it while standing at her kitchen counter, and then found herself staring at the VA envelope that had been haunting her for a week. The return address was from the Regional Benefits Office in Nashville, and Maya could guess at the contents without opening it. Probably a routine inquiry about her benefit status, possibly a notice about upcoming deadlines for claims or appeals. The kind of administrative correspondence that kept the vast machinery of veteran services running, regardless of whether individual veterans wanted to participate in the system. Maya picked up the envelope, turned it over in her hands, and then set it back down unopened. Tomorrow would bring another day at the garage, another opportunity to lose herself in the honest work of fixing broken things. The letter could wait a little longer. But as she prepared for bed, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed isolation was beginning to show cracks. First, Jessica's unexpected appearance, now the persistent intrusion of official correspondence. The world seemed determined to remind her that no one could hide forever, that the past had a way of asserting itself regardless of how deeply it was buried. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out over the quiet streets of Millbrook, Maya made a decision that surprised her. Tomorrow, after work, she will open the letter. Not because she was ready to re-engage with her military past, but because continuing to avoid it was requiring more energy than she could afford to expend. Sometimes, Maya reflected as she finally settled into bed, the bravest thing you could do was simply stop running from yourself. The VA letter lay open on Maya's kitchen table the next morning, its contents more unsettling than she'd anticipated. It wasn't the routine administrative correspondence she'd expected, but rather a notification about a ceremony honoring Purple Heart recipients from her unit. The 82nd Engineer Battalion was being recognized at Fort Campbell, and Maya's name appeared on a list of veterans specifically requested to attend. She stared at the formal invitation, her coffee growing cold, as memories she'd worked so hard to suppress began pushing their way to the surface. Staff Sergeant Maya Richardson, combat engineer. The woman who'd kept supply convoys moving through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. The soldier who'd earned her Purple Heart when an IED had torn through her armored vehicle on a dusty road outside Kandahar. Maya folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her work shirt pocket. She'd dealt with one ghost from her past yesterday with Jessica Walsh's unexpected appearance. Today would bring whatever challenges it brought, but she wouldn't let the ceremony invitation derail her carefully maintained routine. The morning at Henderson's auto repair began like any other, with Maya arriving before dawn to find Eddie's note about a rush job. The mayor's wife needed her Cadillac ready for some important city council meeting. Maya had the luxury sedan running smoothly within an hour, replacing a faulty fuel pump sensor and cleaning a clogged throttle body that had been causing erratic idling. Jessica Walsh arrived around 10 o'clock to check on her father's Ford pickup. Maya had worked late the previous evening to expedite the repairs, partly because she understood the financial pressure the young veteran was under, and partly because she'd found herself genuinely invested in preserving the truck that carried so much emotional weight. "How's she looking?" Jessica asked, running her hand along the truck's faded red paint with obvious affection. "Good as new," Maya replied, handing over the keys. "Replace the oxygen sensor, fix that vacuum leak, and put in new spark plug wires. Should run smoothly for a long time if you keep up with regular maintenance." Jessica's smile was radiant. "You have no idea what this means to me. This truck, it's like having a piece of him still around, you know?" Maya understood better than Jessica could possibly know. She'd once felt the same way about her grandfather's tools, about the worn leather jacket that had belonged to her squad leader, about all the physical reminders of people who'd shaped her life before being torn away by circumstances beyond anyone's control. As Jessica prepared to leave, she paused at the garage entrance. "Maya, I know this might be forward, but would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime? I don't know many people around here, and meeting another veteran." She trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. The invitation caught Maya off guard. She'd become so accustomed to maintaining distance from everyone in Millbrook that the idea of voluntary social interaction felt foreign. But something about Jessica's straightforward honesty, her lack of pretense, made Maya consider possibilities she'd been avoiding for 3 years. "I usually eat lunch at Mel's Diner on Thursdays," Maya heard herself saying. "Nothing fancy, but the food's decent." Jessica's face lit up. "This Thursday?" Quote. Maya nodded, already second-guessing her decision, but unable to take it back. After Jessica drove away, her father's truck purring like a contented cat, Maya tried to focus on her next project, a transmission rebuild that would require several days of intensive work. But concentration proved elusive. The ceremony invitation seemed to burn in her pocket, and she found herself making uncharacteristic mistakes, dropping tools, cross-threading bolts, losing track of which components belonged to which assembly. By noon, Eddie noticed her distraction. "You feeling all right?" he asked, studying Maya with the concerned expression of someone who'd come to rely on her steady reliability. "You seem off today." Maya considered deflecting with her usual minimal response, but Eddie had been nothing but respectful of her privacy for 3 years. He deserved at least partial honesty. "Got some mail yesterday," she said. "Nothing urgent, just complicated." Eddie nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that everyone carried burdens they preferred not to discuss. "Take the afternoon if you need to. Mrs. Patterson isn't picking up her Honda until tomorrow anyway." Maya almost accepted the offer, but the idea of sitting alone in her apartment with her thoughts felt worse than staying busy in the garage. Work had always been her refuge, the place where problems had clear solutions and outcomes could be controlled through skill and determination. "I'm fine," she said. "Just need to focus." The afternoon brought unexpected complications when a convoy of military vehicles pulled into Millbrook for what appeared to be a routine fuel stop. Maya watched through the garage window as soldiers in desert camouflage uniforms stretched their legs and grabbed drinks from the gas station across the street. The sight of their equipment, their easy camaraderie, the familiar rhythm of military efficiency, triggered a cascade of memories that Maya struggled to contain. She remembered the weight of body armor in Afghan heat, the taste of dust that got into everything despite the best efforts to keep it out, the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. She remembered the faces of soldiers who depended on her expertise to keep their vehicles running, who'd trusted her to understand the difference between mechanical problems and potential security threats. Most of all, she remembered the morning when everything changed. The convoy mission that had started like dozens of others, the routine patrol that had ended with twisted metal and blood on sand, the moment when Maya's world had exploded into chaos and pain, and the kind of loss that echoed through every day that followed. Eddie appeared beside her at the window, following her gaze to the military convoy. "National Guard unit from Nashville," he said. "They come through here every few months for training exercises up at the base." Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as a young sergeant directed the refueling operation with the kind of casual competence that took years to develop, the same easy authority Maya had once possessed before everything fell apart. "You know," Eddie continued quietly, "I was in the Navy myself. A long time ago, but some things stick with you." This revelation surprised Maya. In 3 years of working together, Eddie had never mentioned military service. She'd assumed his mechanical knowledge came from civilian training, from the kind of gradual accumulation of skills that characterized most small-town business owners. "Vietnam era," Eddie clarified. "Spent 2 years maintaining aircraft engines on a carrier in the South China Sea. Different war, different branch, but," he shrugged. "Sometimes I see something in your eyes that I recognize from my own mirror." Maya felt exposed, as if her carefully constructed civilian persona had suddenly become transparent, but Eddie's tone carried no judgment, only the quiet understanding of someone who'd walked similar paths. "The thing about coming home," Eddie said, still watching the military convoy, "is that you never really leave it all behind. The best you can do is find a way to make peace with what follows you." Before Maya could respond, Eddie returned to his office, leaving her alone with thoughts that felt too large for the confines of the garage. The military convoy departed 20 minutes later, their vehicles disappearing down Highway 41 in a cloud of diesel exhaust and organizational efficiency. Maya tried to return to her transmission rebuild, but her concentration remained fragmented. Every tool seemed to remind her of similar equipment she'd used in Afghanistan. Every mechanical problem echoed larger challenges she'd faced in environments where failure could mean death for people who depended on her expertise. Around 4 o'clock, as Maya was finally making progress on the transmission, an unmarked black sedan pulled into the garage parking lot. The vehicle was clearly government-issued, too clean, too anonymous, too deliberately unremarkable to belong to any civilian. Maya's trained instincts immediately went on alert, cataloging exit routes and potential threats with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived in hostile territory. The driver remained in the vehicle while a passenger emerged from the rear seat. Maya recognized the man immediately, though she hadn't seen him in person for over 3 years. Colonel Marcus Webb, former commanding officer of Forward Operating Base Crimson, the man who'd recommended Maya for her Purple Heart after the IED incident that had changed everything. Webb had aged since their last meeting, his dark hair now showing gray at the temples, his face bearing new lines that spoke of continued responsibility for other people's lives. But his bearing remained unmistakably military, shoulders squared, movements economical, eyes that missed nothing as he surveyed the garage interior. Maya forced herself to continue working on the transmission, hoping that Webb's presence was coincidental, that he was simply passing through Millbrook on unrelated business. But hope died when he walked directly toward her workstation, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Staff Sergeant Richardson," he said, using her former rank with the kind of natural authority that suggested he'd never really left the military mindset. "It's just Maya now," she replied, not looking up from the transmission case she'd been disassembling. "Been out for 3 years." Webb nodded. "I know. I also know you haven't been responding to correspondence from the VA, haven't attended any unit reunions, haven't maintained contact with anyone from your old unit." Maya finally looked up, meeting Webb's steady gaze. "I did my time, earned my discharge, thought that meant I was free to disappear if I wanted to." "You are," Webb said. "But disappearing and hiding aren't the same thing." The comment stung because it contained too much truth. Maya had indeed been hiding, building walls between herself and anything that might remind her of who she'd been before the explosion that had killed 3 members of her squad and left her with injuries that were more psychological than physical. "What do you want, Colonel?" Maya asked, wiping her hands on a shop rag with more force than necessary. Webb glanced around the garage, taking in the organized chaos of automotive repair, the evidence of Maya's continued expertise with mechanical systems. "I want to offer you an opportunity, something that might help you find your way back to who you really are." Maya felt a familiar surge of the anger that had sustained her through 3 years of determined isolation. "This is who I really am. I fix cars in a small town where nobody asks questions I don't want to answer. It's a good life." "Is it?" Webb's question was gentle but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're hiding from life, not living it." Before Maya could respond, Eddie emerged from his office, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. His experienced eyes immediately assessed the situation. The government sedan, Webb's obvious military bearing, Maya's defensive posture, and his expression shifted to protective wariness. "Afternoon," Eddie said, positioning himself slightly between Maya and Webb. "Something I can help you with?" Webb's smile was genuine as he extended his hand. "Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Army. I served with Maya in Afghanistan. Just wanted to check in on an old soldier." Eddie shook Webb's hand but didn't step aside. "Eddie Henderson. This is my garage, and Maya's one of my best people. I hope there's no suggestion that she's done anything wrong." "Quite the opposite," Webb assured him. "Maya was one of the finest combat engineers I had the privilege to serve with. Her service record is exemplary." Maya watched this exchange with growing unease. Webb's presence represented everything she'd tried to escape. The weight of expectations. The burden of being seen as a hero when she felt more like a survivor. The constant reminder of roads that led to loss and responsibility that felt too heavy to bear. "Colonel," Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I appreciate you checking in, but I'm doing fine. I don't need rescuing or career counseling or whatever this is supposed to be." Webb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The ceremony at Fort Campbell isn't just about recognition, Maya. It's about closure. About acknowledging what happened and finding a way to move forward." Maya felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. "I've moved forward. I have a job, an apartment, a life that works for me." "Do you?" Webb asked again, because the Maya Richardson I knew in Afghanistan was a leader. Someone who took responsibility for others, who solved problems that seemed impossible. who found ways to keep going when everything fell apart. That woman didn't hide from challenges. The words hit harder than Maya expected, cutting through 3 years of careful self-protection to touch nerves she'd thought were safely buried. She wanted to argue, to defend her choices, to explain that sometimes survival meant accepting smaller victories instead of chasing larger purposes. Instead, she found herself remembering the soldier she'd once been. Staff Sergeant Maya Richardson, who'd kept supply convoys moving through enemy territory, who'd innovated solutions to mechanical problems that saved lives, who'd earned the respect of officers and enlisted personnel alike through competence and courage under fire. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who'd possessed certainties and capabilities that civilian Maya had somehow lost along the way. "The ceremony is next weekend," Webb continued. "If you change your mind, transportation can be arranged. Your old squad would like to see you again. They've been wondering how you're doing." Maya's throat tightened at the mention of her squad. The survivors, the ones who'd made it home when others hadn't, who'd probably found better ways to integrate their military experience into civilian lives. The thought of facing them, of seeing questions in their eyes about why she'd disappeared, felt overwhelming. "I'll think about it," Maya said, knowing even as she spoke that she had no intention of attending any ceremony. Webb seemed to understand her reluctance. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, placing it on Maya's workbench beside her tools. "In case you change your mind, or if you ever decide you want to talk to someone who understands what you've been through." After Webb left, the garage felt oppressively quiet. Maya stared at the business card without touching it, as if physical contact might somehow commit her to decisions she wasn't ready to make. Eddie bustled around the garage, giving her space to process while remaining obviously available if she needed support. The day's events had shattered Maya's carefully maintained equilibrium. Jessica Walsh's friendship offer, Eddie's revelation about his own military service, the unexpected appearance of Colonel Webb, all of it felt like the universe conspiring to force her out of the protective isolation she'd cultivated. As closing time approached, Maya found herself thinking about the woman she'd been in Afghanistan. The confident soldier who'd approached problems with systematic thinking and innovative solutions. Who'd earned her Purple Heart not through heroic action, but through doing her job with exceptional skill under impossible circumstances. That woman had been capable of things civilian Maya had forgotten. She'd led teams, made decisions that affected other people's lives, found ways to accomplish missions that seemed doomed from the start. She'd been someone others looked to for answers, for leadership, for the kind of steady competence that held units together in chaotic situations. Maya wondered what had happened to that confidence, that sense of purpose and capability. When had she traded leadership for invisibility, innovation for routine, the satisfaction of difficult challenges for the safety of predictable problems? The questions followed her home that evening, echoing in her small apartment as she heated another frozen dinner and tried to distract herself with automotive magazines. But concentration remained elusive, her mind cycling between memories of who she'd been and uncertainty about who she was becoming. Standing at her kitchen window, looking out over Millbrook's quiet streets, Maya realized that her carefully constructed life was beginning to feel less like safety and more like a cage she'd built for herself. The walls that had protected her from painful memories were also keeping her from possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to consider. Webb's business card sat on her kitchen counter, a small rectangle of cardstock that represented choices Maya wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. But for the first time in 3 years, she found herself wondering what might happen if she stopped running from the woman she used to be and started figuring out who she might become. Thursday arrived with the weight of accumulated decisions Maya had been avoiding. The lunch invitation with Jessica Walsh felt simultaneously insignificant and momentous, a simple meal that represented her first voluntary social engagement in 3 years. As she worked through the morning routine at Henderson's Auto Repair, Maya found herself questioning the wisdom of opening even this small door to human connection. The morning brought Mrs. Chen's SUV back with a new complaint about brake noise that turned out to be nothing more than brake dust accumulation, easily solved with a thorough cleaning. Maya appreciated the straightforward nature of the problem, the way mechanical issues could be diagnosed and resolved without the complex emotional undercurrents that seemed to characterize human relationships. Eddie was dealing with a parts supplier who'd shorted their shipment of oil filters. his voice carrying the practiced frustration of someone who'd spent decades managing the logistics of small business operations. Maya listened to his phone conversation while rebuilding a carburetor for a 1978 Camaro that belonged to Tommy Brennan, a local high school teacher who'd inherited the classic car from his uncle. The Camaro represented the kind of project Maya genuinely enjoyed, a vehicle with character and history, mechanical systems that required understanding rather than just replacement, the satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back to its intended performance. She'd been working on the car for 2 weeks, taking extra care with details that wouldn't be strictly necessary for basic functionality but would honor the craftsmanship of its original builders. Around 11:30, Maya realized she was procrastinating. She'd completed the carburetor rebuild 20 minutes earlier, but continued making minor adjustments that wouldn't significantly improve performance. The truth was that she was nervous about lunch with Jessica, uncertain about her ability to navigate social interaction after so long in self-imposed isolation. Eddie noticed her unusual hesitation. "You got somewhere to be today?" he asked, glancing at the clock that hung beside his calendars featuring various automotive parts distributors. "Lunch," Maya said, the single word carrying more weight than it should have. Eddie's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. "Good. You spend too much time in this garage. Fresh air and conversation might do you some good." Maya wanted to explain that fresh air wasn't the issue. That conversation felt like walking through a minefield where any wrong step might detonate carefully buried explosives. Instead, she simply nodded and began cleaning her tools with more attention than they required. Mel's Diner occupied a corner building on Main Street that had housed various restaurants for the better part of 70 years. The current iteration featured red vinyl booths, a long counter with swivel stools, and the kind of unpretentious atmosphere that attracted both locals and travelers passing through on Highway 41. Maya had eaten there occasionally, usually takeout orders that she'd consume alone in her apartment, but she'd never lingered long enough to engage in the social dynamics that characterized small-town dining establishments. Jessica was already seated in a corner booth when Maya arrived, and she waved with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that Maya found both touching and slightly overwhelming. The young veteran looked different outside the context of automotive repair, less guarded, more relaxed, though Maya's trained eye still noted the way Jessica had chosen a seat with clear sight lines to both entrances. "Thanks for coming," Jessica said as Maya slid into the opposite side of the booth. "I wasn't sure you'd show up." Maya had considered not showing up, had actually driven past the diner twice before finally parking and walking inside. "I said I would," she replied, though they both understood that social commitments weren't always honored, especially by people who'd grown accustomed to isolation. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carol who'd been serving coffee at Mel's for the better part of 2 decades, approached with menus and the kind of practiced cheerfulness that suggested genuine warmth rather than professional obligation. Maya ordered her usual grilled cheese and coffee, while Jessica opted for a burger and sweet tea. "So," Jessica said after Carol had taken their orders, "how long have you been working at Henderson's?" Maya found herself providing basic biographical information. 3 years at the garage, originally from Ohio, moved to Millbrook for the quiet lifestyle. The answers were true but incomplete, careful edits of a more complex story that she wasn't ready to share. Jessica reciprocated with her own background. Originally from Kentucky, she'd enlisted in the Army straight out of high school, served 2 tours in Iraq as a motor transport operator, and had been struggling to find her footing in civilian life since her discharge 18 months earlier. She'd moved to Millbrook because housing was affordable, and the community seemed welcoming to newcomers. "The transition's been harder than I expected," Jessica admitted, stirring sugar into her tea with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested nervous energy. "I thought military experience would translate better to civilian employment, but most employers don't really understand what we actually did over there." Maya understood this frustration intimately. Her own mechanical expertise had been forged in environments where innovation and resourcefulness weren't just valued, but essential for survival, where the difference between adequate and exceptional performance could determine whether people lived or died. But civilian employers saw military service as a vague qualification rather than specific preparation for complex problem-solving. "What kind of work are you doing now?" Maya asked. "Warehouse job at the distribution center outside town," Jessica replied. "It's honest work, pays the bills, but—" She trailed off, seeming to search for words to express something Maya recognized without explanation. The lack of purpose. The absence of a mission. The way civilian employment could feel simultaneously overwhelming and underwhelming, demanding less of your capabilities while somehow being more emotionally exhausting than military service had ever been. Their food arrived, providing a natural pause in conversation that allowed both women to recalibrate. Maya found herself studying Jessica with the kind of analytical attention she'd once applied to mechanical problems, trying to understand what had motivated the invitation and what the young veteran hoped to gain from their interaction. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said, taking a bite of her burger before continuing. "What made you choose automotive repair? It's not exactly a traditional field for women, especially women with our kind of background." Maya considered several possible answers before settling on partial truth. "I've always been good with mechanical systems. After discharge, it seemed like work that would let me use my skills without dealing with too much complexity." Jessica smiled at this diplomatic phrasing. "You mean people. I get that. Machines make sense. They respond predictably to logical inputs. People are messier." This insight surprised Maya with its accuracy. Jessica had articulated something Maya had felt, but never quite expressed: the appeal of working with systems that operated according to comprehensible rules, where cause and effect followed logical patterns, rather than the chaotic unpredictability of human emotion and motivation. "What about you?" Maya asked. "Long-term plans?" Jessica's expression grew thoughtful. "Honestly, I'm not sure. The warehouse job is temporary while I figure things out. I've been thinking about going back to school, maybe studying engineering or logistics. Something that builds on what I learned in the service." Maya recognized the uncertainty in Jessica's voice, the way military veterans often struggled to translate their experience into civilian career paths that felt meaningful. The skills were transferable, but the sense of mission, the feeling of working towards something larger than personal advancement, proved much harder to replicate. "The truck runs great, by the way," Jessica continued. "Whatever you did, it's like having my dad's old Ford back the way it used to be." Maya felt a familiar satisfaction at this praise, the same feeling she'd experienced when keeping critical vehicles operational in Afghanistan. There was something deeply rewarding about taking broken systems and restoring them to full functionality, about solving problems that had defeated other mechanics. "Your father was a mechanic too?" Maya asked. Jessica's expression softened. "Carpenter, actually. But he was one of those guys who could fix anything. Cars, appliances, whatever broke around the house. I learned a lot just watching him work." Maya understood this kind of inherited mechanical intuition, the way some people developed an instinctive understanding of how systems functioned through observation and practice, rather than formal training. Her own grandfather had possessed similar capabilities, though his expertise had been focused on agricultural equipment rather than automotive systems. "He would have liked you," Jessica continued. "He always said you could tell a lot about people by how they approached mechanical problems. Whether they were methodical or careless, whether they understood the difference between fixing something and just making it work temporarily." This observation resonated with Maya more than she was comfortable admitting. Her approach to automotive repair reflected principles she'd learned in military service: thoroughness, attention to detail, understanding that half measures could have consequences far beyond immediate failure. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff David Martinez, a stocky man in his 50s who'd been maintaining law and order in Millbrook for over 2 decades. Martinez approached their table with the easy familiarity of someone who knew most of the diner's regular customers. "Maya," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, "heard you did some work on Mrs. Patterson's Honda. She says it's running better than it has in years." Maya nodded, accepting the compliment with the same uncomfortable grace she applied to all public recognition. She'd never quite adjusted to the way small-town communities monitored and discussed each other's activities, though she understood the impulse toward mutual awareness that characterized places where everyone depended on everyone else. "Sheriff Martinez," she said, "this is Jessica Walsh. She's new to town." Martinez extended his hand to Jessica with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Millbrook. Hope you're finding everything you need." "Yes, sir," Jessica replied, her automatic military courtesy evident in her tone and posture. "It's a nice community." Martinez's experienced eyes registered Jessica's bearing, the subtle indicators that marked her as someone with military training. "Service member?" he asked. "Former Army," Jessica confirmed. "Motor transport." "Well, we appreciate your service," Martinez said. "And if you need anything while you're getting settled, Don't hesitate to reach out. We look after each other around here. After Martinez moved on to his own table, Maya found herself reflecting on the casual way the sheriff had identified Jessica's military background. She wondered what signals she herself might be unconsciously broadcasting, what aspects of her bearing or mannerisms marked her as someone with similar experience. "He seems nice," Jessica observed. "Small-town law enforcement can be hit or miss, but he feels like one of the good ones." Maya agreed, though she'd had minimal interaction with local authorities since moving to Millbrook. Her lifestyle had been specifically designed to avoid the kind of attention that might lead to official scrutiny, though she realized that such avoidance was probably unnecessary in a community like this one. As their lunch wound down, Jessica broached the subject that Maya had been expecting and dreading. "Maya, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I get the feeling you've been dealing with some of the same adjustment challenges I have. If you ever want to talk about it, or just hang out without talking about it, I'd be interested in getting to know you better." The offer was carefully phrased, acknowledging Maya's obvious privacy without demanding explanations she wasn't ready to provide. Jessica was extending friendship without conditions, companionship without obligation, the kind of relationship that might allow Maya to practice social interaction at her own pace. "I'm not very good at friendship," Maya said, surprising herself with the honesty. "I've gotten used to keeping to myself." "That's okay," Jessica replied. "I'm probably rusty at it too, but maybe we could figure it out together." Maya considered the proposition while finishing her coffee. The idea of deliberate social connection felt foreign after 3 years of isolation, but something about Jessica's straightforward approach made it seem less threatening than it might have with someone else. "There's a car show next weekend in Franklin," Maya heard herself saying. "Classic vehicles, custom builds. Might be interesting if you're not busy." Jessica's face lit up. "I'd love that. I don't know much about cars beyond basic maintenance, but I like learning about things I don't understand." As they prepared to leave Mel's diner, Maya realized that she'd just committed to 2 social engagements in 1 week, more human connection than she'd voluntarily engaged in during her entire time in Millbrook. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, representing possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to consider. Walking back to Henderson's auto repair, Maya reflected on the conversation with Jessica. The young veteran's honesty about her own struggles had made Maya feel less isolated in her difficulties, less uniquely damaged by her military experience. There was something comforting about talking to someone who understood the challenge of translating military skills into civilian purposes, who shared the sense of displacement that characterized so many veterans' transition experiences. But the lunch had also highlighted how much of herself Maya was still keeping hidden. She'd shared surface details while avoiding the deeper truths that defined her current existence, the nightmares that still occasionally disrupted her sleep, the hypervigilance that made crowded spaces feel threatening, the way certain sounds could transport her back to dusty roads in Afghanistan, where every piece of debris might conceal an explosive device. Jessica seemed to sense these hidden depths without demanding access to them, which suggested either unusual emotional intelligence or her own experience with psychological wounds that required careful handling. Either way, Maya found herself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of friendship that didn't demand more emotional exposure than she was ready to provide. The afternoon at the garage passed quietly, with Maya focusing on routine maintenance tasks that required minimal concentration. Tommy Brennan's Camaro was ready for pickup, and Maya experienced the familiar satisfaction of seeing a complex restoration project completed to her exacting standards. The car would perform exactly as its original designers had intended, with improvements that honored rather than compromised its essential character. Eddie emerged from his office around 4 o'clock, surveying the garage with the proprietorial pride of someone who'd built something lasting through decades of consistent effort. He noticed Maya's improved mood immediately, the subtle relaxation in her posture that suggested successful social interaction. "Good lunch?" he asked. "Better than expected," Maya replied, which was high praise from someone who'd approached the engagement with significant trepidation. Eddie nodded with satisfaction. Sometimes the things we avoid turn out to be exactly what we need. As closing time approached, Maya found herself thinking about Colonel Webb's business card, still sitting on her kitchen counter like a small monument to decisions she wasn't ready to make. The ceremony of Fort Campbell represented everything Jessica's friendship might help her approach gradually: reconnection with her military identity, acknowledgement of service and sacrifice, the possibility of finding peace with aspects of her past that continued to haunt her present. But unlike Jessica's offered friendship, the ceremony carried implications that Maya wasn't sure she could handle. Facing her former squad mates would mean confronting questions about her 3-year disappearance. Explaining choices that she wasn't sure she understood herself. It would require acknowledging the woman she'd been before the explosion that had changed everything. The confident soldier who'd seemed capable of handling any challenge. That evening, Maya sat in her small apartment, staring at Webb's business card while wrestling with possibilities that felt simultaneously appealing and overwhelming. For the first time in 3 years, she was beginning to understand that healing might require more than just avoiding painful memories. It might require facing them, integrating them, finding ways to honor her military experience without being defined exclusively by its most traumatic moments. The card remained untouched on her counter, but Maya could feel herself moving toward a decision that would require more courage than she'd thought she possessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the social skills she'd let atrophy through years of deliberate isolation. And perhaps, eventually, the strength to reclaim parts of herself that she'd thought were lost forever. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, jarring Maya from restless sleep with the shrill urgency that only emergency phone calls possessed. She fumbled for her cell phone in the darkness, her mind immediately cataloging possibilities. Eddie having a medical emergency, someone needing roadside assistance, wrong numbers that happened with unfortunate frequency in small towns. Maya? Jessica's voice was tight with controlled panic. I'm sorry to wake you, but I didn't know who else to call. My truck broke down on Highway 41, about 10 miles south of town. It just died while I was driving. Maya was already reaching for her clothes, the automatic response of someone who'd spent years responding to mechanical emergencies under pressure. Are you safe? Off the road? Yeah, I'm in the parking lot of that old gas station that's been closed for years. But Maya, Jessica's voice cracked slightly. I think I heard gunshots before the truck died. And there's a vehicle that's been following me since I left work. Maya felt her blood pressure spike as old instincts kicked in. The scenario Jessica described triggered memories of convoy operations in Afghanistan, where mechanical failures in hostile territory could quickly escalate into life-threatening situations. But this was Tennessee, not a war zone. And Maya forced herself to think rationally about civilian explanations for what Jessica was experiencing. Stay on the line, Maya said, pulling on her boots and grabbing the keys to Eddie's tow truck. I'm coming to get you. Keep your doors locked and stay aware of your surroundings. Maya had learned to drive the tow truck months earlier when Eddie had thrown out his back and needed her to handle a roadside recovery. The massive vehicle felt unwieldy compared to the cars she worked on daily, but it was equipped with emergency lights and had the weight to handle whatever they might encounter. The drive south on Highway 41 took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Maya's mind cycled through possibilities, mechanical failure coinciding with Jessica's hypervigilance, creating paranoid interpretations of normal rural sounds, actual criminal activity that had endangered a fellow veteran, some combination of real and perceived threats that required careful assessment. She found Jessica's truck exactly where described, pulled off into the gravel parking lot of Patterson's fuel stop, which had been abandoned since a newer truck stop opened closer to the interstate. Maya positioned the tow truck's emergency lights to illuminate the area, while maintaining clear exit routes, then approached Jessica's vehicle with the cautious awareness that military training had been made automatic. Jessica emerged from the Ford pickup looking shaken but alert, her movements displaying the hypervigilant body language Maya recognized from her own worst nights. Whatever had happened, real or imagined, Jessica was experiencing the kind of stress response that fellow veterans understood without explanation. What exactly happened? Maya asked, beginning her examination of the truck's engine compartment with a flashlight while keeping her awareness expanded to monitor their surroundings. I was driving home from my shift at the warehouse, Jessica explained, her voice steadier now that help had arrived. About 15 miles back, I noticed headlights that seemed to be staying the same distance behind me, matching my speed changes. Then I heard what sounded like gunshots. 3 or 4 pops in quick succession. Right after that, the engine started sputtering and died completely. Maya's flashlight beam revealed the problem immediately. The truck's distributor cap showed fresh damage, small holes that looked suspiciously like bullet impacts. Additional examination revealed that at least 2 spark plug wires had been severed, explaining the engine failure that had stranded Jessica in this isolated location. "Jessica," Maya said carefully, "those weren't coincidental sounds you heard. Someone shot at your truck." The young veteran's face went pale in the flashlight beam. "Are you serious?" Maya pointed to the damaged components, explaining how the bullet impacts had disabled the ignition system. The shots had been precisely placed to cause mechanical failure without immediately endangering the driver. The work of someone who understood automotive systems and had intended to strand rather than harm. "But why would someone—" Jessica trailed off, confusion and fear evident in her expression. Before Maya could respond, headlights appeared on Highway 41, approaching from the south at a speed that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Maya instinctively positioned herself between Jessica and the approaching vehicle, her hand moving to the tire iron she'd grabbed from the tow truck. The vehicle, a dark pickup truck with tinted windows, slowed as it passed the abandoned gas station, and Maya caught a glimpse of multiple occupants before it accelerated away into the darkness. The brief sighting wasn't enough for identification, but something about the vehicle's deliberate pace suggested surveillance rather than coincidental travel. "We need to get out of here," Maya said, beginning to connect the tow cables to Jessica's disabled truck. "Now." The recovery process took 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, with both women maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings while Maya efficiently prepared Jessica's truck for transport. The work was complicated by darkness and the need for speed, but Maya's experience with emergency recoveries under pressure served them well. As they prepared to leave, Maya noticed fresh tire tracks in the gravel that didn't match Jessica's vehicle or the tow truck. Someone had been in this location recently, probably within the last few hours, and the tracks suggested a vehicle that had been positioned with clear sight lines to the highway. "Maya," Jessica said as they climbed into the tow truck's cab, "I think this might be connected to something that happened at work yesterday." Maya started the engine and pulled onto Highway 41, checking her mirrors constantly while Jessica explained. The warehouse where she worked handled distribution for several regional businesses, including a company that Jessica had recently noticed seemed to operate with unusual security measures and irregular schedules. "I probably shouldn't have said anything," Jessica continued, "but I mentioned to my supervisor that I'd noticed some shipments being handled differently from the standard procedures. Off-book manifests, vehicles arriving without proper documentation, workers I'd never seen before." Maya felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. Jessica's military background in logistics would have given her expertise in recognizing irregularities in supply chain operations, the kind of anomalies that might indicate illegal activity disguised as legitimate business. "What did your supervisor say?" Maya asked, maintaining careful speed while monitoring the road behind them. "He told me to mind my own business and focus on my assigned duties. But Maya, the way he said it, it felt like a warning, not just supervision." Maya understood the implication. Jessica had inadvertently stumbled into something that required her silence, and someone had decided that mechanical intimidation might be more effective than verbal warnings in ensuring her cooperation. They reached Henderson's auto repair without incident, and Maya parked the tow truck in the garage while Jessica's damaged Ford remained on the trailer outside. The familiar environment of the shop felt reassuring after the tension of the highway recovery, but Maya knew that bringing Jessica's truck to the garage might have transferred the problem to her own doorstep. "What happens now?" Jessica asked, exhaustion evident in her voice as adrenaline began to fade. Maya considered their options while examining the damaged truck more thoroughly. The bullet impacts were precise, professional, intended to disable rather than destroy. Someone with military or law enforcement training had executed this operation, which suggested that Jessica had stumbled into something more serious than simple criminal activity. "First, we document everything," Maya said, photographing the damage from multiple angles with her phone. "Then we decide whether to involve local law enforcement." Jessica's expression showed conflict between civilian instincts that said they should report the incident and military-trained wariness about involving authorities in situations they might not understand or be equipped to handle properly. "Sheriff Martinez seemed trustworthy when we met him at the diner," Jessica said. "But if this involves the warehouse, and the warehouse has connections to whatever I witnessed..." Maya understood the dilemma. Small-town law enforcement might be compromised by relationships with local businesses, or simply lack the resources to investigate complex criminal operations. But handling the situation themselves carried risks that neither woman was fully prepared to address. "We need more information before we make that decision," Maya said. "And we need to make sure you're safe tonight." Jessica's apartment was a studio unit above the town's only laundromat, accessible through an external staircase that would be difficult to secure against determined intruders. Maya's own apartment above the hardware store was marginally more defensible, but would require explaining Jessica's presence to her landlord. "There's a third option," Maya said, an idea that surprised her with its implications. "Eddie's got a small apartment behind the garage that he uses for storage. It's got a bathroom, a kitchenette, and only one entrance that we can monitor." The suggestion meant acknowledging to Eddie that she was involved in something that went beyond routine automotive repair, potentially compromising the low-profile existence she'd cultivated for 3 years. But Jessica's safety took precedence over Maya's preference for invisibility. Eddie arrived at the garage 20 minutes after Maya called him, moving with the purposeful energy of someone who'd received enough emergency calls over the decades to respond without unnecessary questions. His assessment of the situation was swift and practical. "Bullets through the distributor cap," he said, examining Jessica's truck with a flashlight. "Professional work. Someone wanted to disable the vehicle without killing the driver." Maya was impressed by Eddie's immediate understanding of the tactical implications. His Navy background had apparently included more than aircraft engine maintenance, or perhaps decades of small-town living had exposed him to various forms of criminal activity. "Jessica can use the back apartment as long as necessary," Eddie continued, "but we need to be smart about this. If someone's willing to shoot up vehicles to make a point, they might escalate to more direct methods if they feel ignored." Quote, "As dawn broke over Millbrook, Maya found herself in a situation she'd spent 3 years avoiding, responsible for another person's safety in circumstances that required the kind of tactical thinking she'd hoped to leave behind in Afghanistan. Jessica's crisis had forced Maya to engage skills and instincts that she'd been trying to suppress, pulling her back toward the military mindset she'd been working so hard to escape. But as she helped Jessica settle into the temporary apartment behind the garage, Maya realized that this sense of purpose, of being needed for something more complex than routine automotive repair, felt oddly familiar and satisfying. For the first time in 3 years, she was using her full range of capabilities to solve a problem that mattered. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years hiding from her military identity, only to discover that civilian life had now presented her with a situation that required exactly the skills and mindset she'd been trying to forget. As the sun fully rose, Maya stood in the garage doorway looking out at the peaceful streets of Millbrook while contemplating possibilities she'd never considered. Perhaps the woman she'd been in Afghanistan, the problem solver, the leader, the soldier who could function under pressure, wasn't something to be buried and forgotten. Perhaps that woman was exactly who Jessica needed her to be. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, representing possibilities that Maya hadn't allowed herself to consider since her discharge. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself wondering what might happen if she stopped running from her military identity and started integrating it into her civilian life. Colonel Webb's business card sat on her kitchen counter, but for the first time since he'd visited, Maya was beginning to understand that the choice it represented wasn't about returning to her past. It was about deciding what parts of her military experience might help her build a better future. The morning ahead would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to protect Jessica while investigating the warehouse situation that had put her in danger. But for now, Maya allowed herself to acknowledge something she'd been denying for 3 years. She was good at this kind of work, and maybe, just maybe, the world needed the woman she'd been trained to be. 3 days after the shooting incident, Maya was elbow deep in the engine compartment of a 2019 Silverado when the black sedan pulled into Henderson's auto repair for the second time in 2 weeks. Through the garage bay opening, she watched as the same government vehicle that had brought Colonel Webb now disgorged a different passenger, a woman in dress blues whose bearing screamed a senior officer even at a distance. Maya's hands stilled on the wrench she'd been using to adjust the truck's alternator belt. 3 silver stars gleamed on the woman's shoulder boards, catching the afternoon sunlight in a way that made Maya's chest tighten with recognition. Brigadier General Patricia Thornton had been a legend even when Maya was serving, the first woman to command an engineering brigade in combat, known for her tactical brilliance and unwavering support of the soldiers under her command. General Thornton approached the garage with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, her eyes taking in details with the systematic assessment that marked career military officers. She stopped just inside the garage entrance, waiting for Maya to acknowledge her presence rather than demanding immediate attention. Staff Sergeant Richardson, Thornton said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made subordinates stand straighter without conscious thought. We need to talk. Maya set down her tools and turned to face the general, automatically coming to a position that wasn't quite attention but showed appropriate respect. Ma'am, I assume Colonel Webb sent you. Colonel Webb is concerned about you, Thornton replied, but I'm here for different reasons. May we speak privately? Maya glanced toward Eddie's office, where the older man was conspicuously focused on paperwork that probably didn't require such intense concentration. We can use the break room. The small space felt even more cramped with a general occupying it, but Thornton's presence somehow made the room feel more substantial rather than smaller. She accepted Maya's offer of coffee and settled into one of the mismatched chairs with the kind of adaptability that marked officers who'd spent time in forward operating bases. I understand you've had some excitement recently, Thornton began, her tone conversational but her eyes alert. Vehicles disabled by gunfire, young women in potential danger, local law enforcement struggling to understand the implications. Maya felt a chill of recognition. If General Thornton knew about Jessica's situation, it meant federal attention had already been drawn to whatever was happening at the warehouse. The implications of that attention could be either reassuring or terrifying, depending on which federal agencies were involved. How do you know about that? Maya asked. Thornton smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and calculated information control. Because the warehouse your friend stumbled into has been under federal investigation for 6 months. Drug trafficking, arms smuggling, money laundering, the full criminal enterprise package. Ms. Walsh's observations confirm intelligence we've been gathering through other channels. Maya processed this information while reassessing everything that had happened since Jessica's truck was disabled. If federal agencies were already investigating the warehouse, then the shooting incident represented an escalation that someone in authority had been expecting. Why are you telling me this? Maya asked. And why is a general involved in what sounds like a criminal investigation? Thornton's expression grew more serious. Because some of the weapons being moved through that warehouse have military origins. Because the people running the operation include former military personnel who are using their training and connections for criminal purposes. And because we need someone with your specific skill set to help us shut them down. Maya felt the familiar surge of resistance that had characterized her response to any suggestion that she re-engage with military operations. I'm out, General. I have been for 3 years. I fix cars now. You fix cars very well, Thornton agreed. But you also responded to an emergency situation 3 nights ago with tactical precision that kept a fellow veteran safe. You assessed threats, implemented security measures, and coordinated resources under pressure. Those aren't civilian mechanic skills, Richardson. The observation stung because it was accurate. Maya had indeed reverted to military thinking when Jessica's safety was threatened, had found herself operating with competence and confidence she'd forgotten she possessed. What exactly are you asking me to do? Maya said. Thornton leaned forward, her manner shifting from conversational to briefing mode. We need someone to get inside the warehouse operation, someone with mechanical expertise who can assess their vehicle modifications, document their equipment, and gather intelligence about their capabilities and intentions. Maya's laugh was short and bitter. You want me to go undercover, in a criminal organization, because I can fix cars. Because you can fix cars. Because you understand military logistics, because you have the tactical training to operate in hostile environments, and because you're already involved whether you want to be or not, Thornton corrected. The moment you helped Jessica Walsh, you became a person of interest to the people running that warehouse. This last point hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Maya had indeed painted a target on herself by interfering with whatever message the shooting was supposed to convey. Her involvement was no longer optional if she wanted to keep Jessica safe. And if I refuse? Maya asked. Thornton's expression remained neutral. Then we'll find another way to investigate the operation. Ms. Walsh will remain in protective custody until we can build a case through conventional means, and you'll go back to fixing cars while looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. The general stood, preparing to leave. But before you decide, there's something else you should know. 3 members of your old squad from Afghanistan are currently serving in various capacities with federal law enforcement. They've specifically requested you to work this operation if you agree to participate. Maya felt her world tilt slightly. Who? Sergeant Martinez is with the DEA now. Specialist Brooks works cybercrimes for the FBI. Corporal Davis is ATF. They've all been following your disappearance with concern, and they'd very much like the opportunity to work with their old squad leader again. Squad leader. Maya hadn't heard that designation in 3 years, and had almost convinced herself that the woman who'd earned that responsibility no longer existed. But Thornton's casual use of the title brought back memories of soldiers who'd trusted her judgment, who'd followed her lead through situations where mistakes could be fatal. "I need time to think about this," Maya said. Thornton nodded and placed a business card on the break room table. 24 hours. The operation is moving forward with or without you, but having you involved would significantly increase our chances of success and minimize risk to everyone involved. Quote. After the general left, Maya sat alone in the break room, staring at the business card while trying to process the magnitude of what she'd just been offered. The opportunity to work with her old squad members was simultaneously appealing and terrifying, representing connections to her military identity that she'd thought were permanently severed. Eddie appeared in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Important conversation?" "Complicated conversation," Maya replied. "About whether the person I used to be might be needed for something important." Eddie studied her for a moment. "You know, I never told you why I really hired you." Maya looked up, curious about this unexpected revelation. "It wasn't just because you could diagnose that transmission problem," Eddie continued. "It was because of the way you approached it. Methodical, confident, like someone who'd solved much bigger problems under much worse conditions. I figured anyone with that kind of composure had stories worth respecting, even if they didn't want to share them." Maya felt a surge of gratitude for Eddie's perceptiveness and discretion. "And now? Now I think maybe those stories are exactly what someone needs," Eddie said. "And maybe it's time you stopped running from the person who lived with them." That evening, Maya found herself standing outside the small apartment behind the garage where Jessica was staying, holding General Thornton's business card and wrestling with possibilities that felt both familiar and foreign. Jessica answered her knock immediately, moving with the alert wariness of someone who'd been living with constant vigilance for 3 days. Her relief at seeing Maya was evident, but so was the stress of forced isolation and uncertainty about the future. "Any news?" Jessica asked, stepping aside to let Maya enter the cramped space. Maya explained about General Thornton's visit, about the federal investigation, about the opportunity to actively participate in shutting down the operation that had put Jessica in danger. She watched Jessica's expression cycle through relief, apprehension, and something that might have been pride. "You're thinking about doing it," Jessica observed. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," Maya replied, "including the fact that my old squad apparently wants to work together again." Jessica's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness Maya had seen from her in days. "That's amazing. When was the last time you saw them?" Quote, 3 years ago, at the memorial service for the squad members who didn't make it home." The weight of that revelation settled between them, explaining aspects of Maya's isolation that Jessica had probably sensed but never questioned. The survivor's guilt that had driven Maya to hide from anyone who might remind her of what she'd lost. Of the soldiers who died while she lived. "Maya," Jessica said carefully, "maybe this is exactly what you've been needing. Not to forget what happened, but to honor it by using what you learned to help people." Maya looked at the business card again, seeing it not as a demand to return to her military past, but as an opportunity to integrate that experience into a future that might actually matter. For the first time in 3 years, she was beginning to understand that healing might not mean forgetting. It might mean remembering with purpose. "If I do this," Maya said, "I'll need you to stay safe while it's happening." Jessica's smile was radiant. "I'll be right here, cheering you on." Maya made her decision. The warehouse operation unfolded over 6 weeks that transformed Maya Richardson from a hidden mechanic into the squad leader she'd forgotten she could be, working alongside Martinez, Brooks, and Davis, her old squad members who'd found their own paths into federal law enforcement. Maya infiltrated the criminal network by posing as a specialized mechanic capable of modifying vehicles for illegal transport operations. The work was dangerous, complex, and oddly familiar. Maya found herself using skills she'd buried for 3 years, thinking tactically about problems that extended far beyond automotive repair. Her mechanical expertise provided legitimate cover, while she documented the sophisticated operation that was moving military-grade weapons, drugs, and money through a network that stretched across 3 states. But it was the relationships that proved most transformative. Working with Martinez, Brooks, and Davis again reminded Maya of the woman she'd been before the explosion that had killed their squadmates. Confident, capable, trusted by others to make decisions under pressure. Her old friends didn't treat her like damaged goods or ask uncomfortable questions about her 3-year disappearance. They simply welcomed back their squad leader and got to work. The operation culminated in a coordinated raid that netted 17 arrests and seized enough evidence to dismantle the entire network. Maya's intelligence had been crucial to the success. Her understanding of the vehicles and logistics that made the operation possible, providing law enforcement with the tactical advantages they needed to move safely and effectively. Jessica had remained in the apartment behind Henderson's auto repair throughout the operation, her presence providing Maya with an emotional anchor that helped her navigate the psychological challenges of returning to military-style operations. Every evening, Maya would debrief informally with Jessica, processing the day's experiences with someone who understood the complexities of translating military skills into civilian law enforcement contexts. Eddie had proven to be an invaluable ally, his garage serving as legitimate cover for the federal operation, while his own military background allowed him to provide practical support that civilian business owners might not have understood. The older man had embraced his role with enthusiasm, clearly energized by the opportunity to contribute to something more significant than routine automotive repair. But the real transformation happened inside Maya herself. Day by day, operation by operation, she began to integrate the confident soldier she'd been with the civilian woman she was becoming. The process wasn't seamless. There were moments of doubt, flashes of trauma, nights when memories of Afghanistan threatened to overwhelm her newfound sense of purpose. But with the support of her old squad and the grounding presence of Jessica and Eddie, Maya began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting her military experience. It was about finding ways to honor that experience while building a life that incorporated rather than buried her service identity. The morning after the final raid, Maya stood in the garage that had become her sanctuary, looking at the Purple Heart medal she'd retrieved from her dresser drawer for the first time in 3 years. The small piece of metal and ribbon represented both her service and her sacrifice, her courage and her loss, the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. General Thornton arrived at Henderson's auto repair that morning, not in the official black sedan but driving her own pickup truck, dressed in civilian clothes that somehow made her military bearing even more evident. She found Maya in the garage, cleaning tools with the meditative precision that had become her signature approach to automotive work. "Staff Sergeant," Thornton said, though her tone was less formal than during their previous conversation. "Excellent work on the warehouse operation. Your intelligence was instrumental in our success." Maya looked up from the wrench she'd been cleaning. "Thank you, ma'am. It felt good to be useful again." Thornton smiled, studying Maya with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent decades evaluating soldiers under various conditions. "I have a proposition for you. The federal task force we assembled for this operation was so effective that there's interest in making it permanent. A specialized unit that combines military experience with civilian law enforcement expertise to handle cases involving former military personnel who've gone criminal." Maya considered this possibility while finishing her cleaning routine. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a career. A chance to use your complete skill set in service to something larger than yourself. Your old squad members have already expressed interest in continuing to work together." The proposition was tempting, representing the kind of meaningful work that Maya had been missing since her discharge. But she'd also come to value the life she'd built in Millbrook, the relationships she'd developed, the sense of community that had gradually replaced her isolation. "I appreciate the offer, General," Maya said, "but I think I've found where I belong." Thornton nodded with what might have been approval. "I suspected you might say that. But there's another option we should discuss." She explained about a consulting arrangement that would allow Maya to remain in Millbrook while providing expertise to federal operations on an as-needed basis. She could continue working at Henderson's auto repair, maintain her civilian life, but also contribute her unique skills to cases that required her particular combination of mechanical and tactical expertise. "Part-time hero work," Maya said, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Full-time mechanic. Part-time federal consultant," Thornton corrected. The best of both worlds, if you're interested. Maya found herself considering possibilities she'd never imagined. The arrangement would allow her to honor her military experience without being defined exclusively by it, to use her skills in service to others without sacrificing the stability and community she'd built in Millbrook. "I'll need to discuss it with my business partner," Maya said, glancing toward Eddie's office. Thornton's eyebrows rose. "Business partner?" Maya explained about Eddie's offer to make her a full partner in Henderson's Auto Repair, the opportunity to gradually take over operations as Eddie approached retirement. The garage that had started as her hiding place was becoming her foundation, the platform from which she could contribute to her community while remaining available for federal consulting work. "It sounds like you've figured out how to integrate all aspects of your identity," Thornton observed. "That's not an easy accomplishment for someone with your background." After Thornton left, Maya found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from isolation to integration, from hiding to belonging. The garage around her was the same physical space where she'd spent 3 years avoiding her past, but it now felt like something entirely different, a home base from which she could engage with the world rather than hide from it. Jessica appeared in the garage doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that had become Maya's favorite sight in the world. The young veteran had decided to stay in Millbrook, accepting a position with the county's emergency management office that would allow her to use her logistics expertise in civilian disaster response operations. "So," Jessica said, handing Maya one of the coffee cups, "ready to become a part-time federal consultant?" Maya had told Jessica about Thornton's offer during their conversation the previous evening, and Jessica's enthusiastic support had helped Maya understand that accepting the consulting arrangement wouldn't represent a betrayal of her civilian life, but rather an expansion of it. "I think so," Maya replied, "as long as my consulting partner approves." Jessica's confusion was evident. "Consulting partner?" Maya smiled, feeling nervous about the proposition she was about to make. The federal task force needs someone with logistics expertise, someone who understands supply chain operations and can recognize irregularities that might indicate criminal activity. Someone with military experience who can work effectively with law enforcement agencies. Jessica's eyes widened as she understood what Maya was suggesting. "You want me to work with you?" "I want us to work together. Maya and Jessica Consulting Services will handle the automotive and logistics aspects of federal investigations while maintaining our civilian careers. What do you think?" Jessica's response was to throw her arms around Maya in a hug that expressed everything words couldn't capture. The embrace represented acceptance, partnership, the kind of trust and affection that Maya had thought she'd lost the right to experience. Eddie emerged from his office, drawn by the sound of their conversation, and his grin suggested he'd been expecting this development. "So Henderson's Auto Repair is about to become the cover for a federal consulting operation?" Maya looked around the garage that had sheltered her during her worst years and was now launching her into her best possibilities. "Is that going to be a problem?" Eddie's laugh was rich with satisfaction. "Are you kidding? At my age, having a little excitement in the business is exactly what I need. Besides, Margaret's going to love telling her friends that our garage is secretly working with the FBI." That afternoon, Maya drove to the Millbrook Cemetery, carrying the Purple Heart that she'd kept hidden for 3 years. She found the section reserved for veterans, where small American flags marked the graves of men and women who'd served their country in various conflicts and eras. She knelt beside a headstone that bore the name of her grandfather, the man who'd taught her to work with her hands and think systematically about mechanical problems. The grandfather who'd served in Vietnam and had understood, even before Maya enlisted, that some kinds of service left marks that never fully healed but could be transformed into wisdom. Maya placed the Purple Heart on the headstone, not as a permanent offering, but as a temporary acknowledgement of the journey that had brought her from Afghanistan to Millbrook to this moment of integration and acceptance. "I think I've finally figured out how to honor the service without being destroyed by the sacrifice," she said quietly. "I think you'd be proud of the woman I'm becoming." A gentle breeze stirred the small flags around the cemetery, and Maya chose to interpret it as approval from the generations of veterans who'd found their own ways to carry their service into civilian life. Driving back to Henderson's Auto Repair, Maya reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past several weeks. She was still the mechanic who could diagnose complex automotive problems with exceptional skill. She was still the veteran who carried memories of service and loss that would always be part of her identity. But she was also something new. A woman who'd learned to integrate rather than segregate the different aspects of herself, who'd found ways to honor her past while building a future that incorporated rather than denied her complete identity. The garage came into view, with Jessica's restored Ford pickup parked beside Eddie's tow truck and the various customer vehicles that represented the ongoing rhythm of small-town automotive repair. But Maya now saw the garage as more than a hiding place or even a business. It was a foundation, a launching point, a place where different kinds of service could coexist and support each other. She pulled into the parking lot just as a military convoy was passing through town on Highway 41, and for the first time in 3 years, the sight of uniformed soldiers didn't trigger painful memories or anxious avoidance. Instead, Maya felt a quiet sense of connection, a recognition of shared experience that didn't require explanation or justification. As she walked into the garage where Jessica and Eddie were examining the engine of Mrs. Patterson's Honda, Maya understood that she'd finally answered the question that had haunted her since her discharge. What happens to a soldier when the war ends? The answer, she now knew, was that the war never really ends. But it transforms. The mission continues in different forms, using different tools, serving different communities. The skills remain relevant, the sense of purpose endures, the commitment to something larger than oneself finds new expressions. Maya Richardson had spent 3 years thinking she was hiding from her military identity. In reality, she'd been preparing for the next phase of her service, building the civilian foundation that would allow her to contribute her unique capabilities to challenges that civilian-only or military-only approaches couldn't address effectively. The quiet mechanic at the garage had never really been quiet. She'd simply been waiting for the right moment, the right mission, the right team to remind her that some kinds of service evolve rather than end. As Maya picked up her tools and returned to the honest work of fixing broken things, she carried with her the Purple Heart that no longer represented just sacrifice and loss, but also resilience, growth, and the kind of quiet heroism that finds ways to serve without fanfare. The garage hummed with the familiar sounds of productive work, and Maya Richardson, mechanic, veteran, consultant, friend, settled into the rhythm of a life that finally felt complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.